Hello and welcome to the December Wednesday webinar from the IEACCC Coal Centre. My name is Benedict Brox and I'm the Communications Officer here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website, www.iea-coal.org. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organisations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration. Please visit our website for details. The subject for today's webinar is Electricity Market Designs for a Reliable Grid and their Impact on Coal Plant, presented by Dr. Toby Lockwood. The report on this topic will be published early next year.
Thanks, Benedict, and hello, everyone. I'm Toby Lockwood, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this IEACCC Coal Centre webinar for December. So this presentation will cover some of the content of the forthcoming report Benedicta mentioned, which is on changes in electricity market design related to ensuring grid reliability and how these changes have affected coal plant in particular. As Benedicta said, this should be out early next year and it will be in draft form shortly. So we welcome any input or comments at this stage. So the title of this study is rather long, but essentially we were talking about two areas of electricity market design. Firstly, the current trend for capacity mechanisms to ensure resource adequacy. And secondly, changes in markets for ancillary services or grid services, which grid operators use to ensure that they have a stable grid. These markets both have the potential to reward attributes of thermal plant which may not have been sufficiently valued in the traditional wholesale energy market. Just a reminder to listeners that I will answer any questions at the end, so you can enter them on your screens. So I'm going to start with a little background on energy markets, as the report also serves as something of a primer on how these operate. The issues we're looking at today really concern liberalised markets, which mainly emerged in the 1990s and early 2000s in North America and Europe. There was a shift from vertically integrated utilities, which controlled generation, transmission and supply of electricity, to more competitive markets, which only the transmission network is regulated and generators compete to supply electricity at the lowest price. This often takes place on day-ahead spot markets or close to real time up until less than an hour before electricity is delivered. In the US, a centralized market is commonly used, while in Europe there are several markets where the spot market and bilateral trading operate independently of the system operator. However, there is always a system operator which must ensure that supply matches demand at all times and generally maintains grid reliability. This slide shows the status of market liberalisation around the world, highlighting that we're primarily interested in the pale areas, this plot, which is in North America, Europe and Australia. Another major change that has taken place in many of these same markets in the last 10 years is the arrival of wind and solar power, which I call variable renewable energy, or VRE, throughout this presentation. Growth in these energy sources has been driven variously by initiatives such as guaranteed power prices, tax credits, deployment targets, and supplier portfolio standards. These resources present an added challenge to system operators, as their output depends on the weather, so their contribution to reserve margins is less well defined, and they also do not provide some crucial grid services, which I will discuss later. At the same time, coal plant is no longer able to operate as a baseload generator and is instead required to cycle its output during the day or only meet seasonal demand peaks. This is illustrated by the example of Germany in November 2018 on the right. Combined with cheap gas prices in the US and CO2 prices in the EU, coal plant retirements have accelerated. Here's a quick look at some key EU states listed more or less in order of increasing renewable deployment as a proportion of generation. We can see that the UK, Spain and Germany all have levels of around 20%, 25% in the mix, with Ireland a bit higher and Denmark streaks ahead at nearly 50%. This is mostly all wind power, though there is a fair amount of solar in Germany and Spain. In the EU, around 40 gigawatts of coal has been retired since 2010. This is a similar look at the US with a useful chart from the US Department of Energy showing the timeline of additions and retirements from the generation fleet since 1950. You can easily see the boom in gas generation in the early 2000s, followed by the recent wave of wind and solar there in orange and yellow. Coal retirements can be seen below the line, mainly from 2012 onwards. I've also shown the generation mix of two grid areas which I cover in this report, ERCOT, which covers Texas and has a relatively high level of wind power, and PJM, which is in the mid-Atlantic and uses mainly coal, gas and nuclear plants. So the reason for conducting this study is that there appears to be growing concern in many liberalised grids around the world that energy markets alone are struggling to provide adequate incentives for new capacity. In some regions, reserve margins have fallen, and as thermal plant is retired and VRE takes its place, there is nevertheless a need for what we call firm or dispatchable capacity, which can provide backup when wind and solar plants are offline. Moreover, the composition of the grid is changing from the model established at the beginning of the liberalisation period, and it's uncertain whether the market will deliver a grid that possesses the same reliability attributes. What are those reliability attributes? Most basically, there must be sufficient capacity on the grid to meet future peak demand, plus reserve margin. This must take into account changes in demand and the long lead time for power plant development. Secondly, some of that capacity must be flexible enough to respond to short-term changes in demand by ramping up and down. On shorter time scales, there must be generators or demand response even that can respond very rapidly to imbalances in supply and demand in order to maintain grid frequency. Thirdly, units are required to supply reactive power, which is a property that controls grid voltage on a local level. Fourthly, there must be sufficient transmission capacity to distribute these energy and these services, or the ability to provide them more locally. Lastly, there's a growing concern in some regions over the reliability and price risk of fuel supply. So this section of the webinar will look at the first of those reliability attributes, often known as resource adequacy. There's a long-standing economic debate about whether wholesale electricity markets can drive sufficient investment in new plant. The problem is often referred to as the missing money problem, as market prices can be capped to minimise risk to consumers, so the true value of generation may not be obtained from the market. Furthermore, most markets see almost no participation from the demand side, so there are no strong price signals reflecting the value of power to consumers. In the old-style vertically integrated model, utilities would simply forecast future demand and pass on costs of new capacity through regulated tariffs. Another approach is a strategic reserve, where a few power plants are kept out of the energy market, but used in case of emergency high demand. A widespread approach is a centralised market for capacity run by the system operator, which pays plants simply for being available, and we will look at a couple of examples of these. The polar opposite philosophy is an energy-only market where there is no value on capacity, but energy prices are allowed to go very high in times of scarcity, hopefully helping to drive investment. This slide shows how some of these different approaches are being adopted across Europe and the US. You can see that centralized capacity markets have been adopted by several system operators in the US, seen in the east there, as well as in Great Britain, Ireland, Italy, Poland and Greece. Germany operates a strategic reserve, while Texas is notable for having an entirely energy-only approach. This slide just shows some of the regions covered by case studies in the report, although I will not cover all of them fully today. The figure on the right shows the division of the US into different grid regions known as independent system operators or regional transmission organizations. This shows PJM, which I mentioned earlier, stretching from the Midwest to the Mid-Atlantic seaboard. The other system operators we just saw operating capacity markets are the Midwestern ISO, the New York ISO, and the ISO for New England. Firstly, I'm going to give a bit of a primer on how capacity markets operate. Obligations to provide capacity at some future date are auctioned with bids from existing generators, proposals for new plant, demand response, often as well as things like batteries and interconnections to other regions. Usually there is a demand curve showing the price at which the system operator would buy varying levels of capacity. This is based on a target capacity calculated by the system operator and a cost of new entry as a guide price, which is based on the estimated price it would take to drive investment in a new gas plant normally. The auction proceeds via sealed bids or a descending clock format, depending on region. And existing generators are usually restricted to a role as a price taker. They can only bid above a certain threshold. The bids produce a supply curve, and the point where supply and demand cross is the clearing price and the capacity procured, and the clearing price is paid to all successful generators. So that curve I just showed is the one used by PJM, where a capacity market was introduced in 2007 and is known as the reliability pricing model. It mainly procures capacity 3 years in advance, as well as running interim auctions. The market was implemented following concerns over insufficient capacity earlier in the 2000s, but it has arguably been too successful, with reserve margins well above the roughly 14% recommended by the Reliability Council in North America. An interesting development in PJM is an ongoing dispute over how to deal with subsidized generation, such as wind and solar plant, which followed a complaint from some gas-powered generators. Several proposals so far have been rejected by the federal regulator, and the auction in 2019 was postponed. Here are some results from the PJM capacity market showing a fairly steady contribution from coal plant, but a big increase in gas plant winning contracts since the shale gas boom in the US. The clearing price saw a significant increase in 2018, probably in response to several coal and nuclear plant closures, which represented a windfall for successful generators. The plot, so this plot shows that the capacity market represents a fairly sizable proportion of the total cost of electricity in the region, and one that has grown in relative terms from the early years of the market. So the capacity market is vital for the financial viability of many coal plants in PJM. The orange bars in this plot show the proportion of coal plants which can cover their avoidable costs from the energy and ancillary service markets alone. And the blue bars represent those covering costs once capacity market revenue has been added to this. You can see there's a significant increase there. Even with both markets' revenue, there is a shortfall for around 37% of plants in 2018, putting them at high risk of retirement. As I mentioned, a polar opposite approach has been adopted in the Lone Star states. Here, the wholesale price is allowed to rise to a relatively high cap of $9,000 per megawatt hour during times of energy scarcity, representing something called the value of lost load, which is the price at which consumers would prefer to go without power, although that in itself is difficult to estimate. There is also a price adder which supplements the energy price as the operating reserves on the system fall. ERCOT presents a very different environment to PJM, as there is very high penetration of wind power and a steady demand growth in the state, which is quite unusual in the US. Recently, there have been concerns that the ERCOT system is not delivering sufficient resource adequacy, as reserve margins fall very low during summer months of peak demand, especially when wind output is low. This has been particularly tested by the retirement of around 5 gigawatts of coal plant in 2018. In summer of 2019, the margin fell below 9%. The $9,000 per megawatt hour price cap was reached a few times, and 2 energy emergency alerts were called in which consumers have to limit unnecessary consumption. This covers things like air conditioning, and the effects of that in Texas can be clearly seen on the right. What's more, revenue from the energy market is still below the cost of new entry for CCGT, so there is limited new plant being built in the state. Reserve margins are expected to increase in the near term, though largely this is due to more wind power. Advocates of this system maintain that scarcity events and temporarily lower reserve margins are a fundamental feature of the market doing its job. Turning now to Europe, Poland recently set up a capacity market along very similar lines as the US model. It runs ran 3 auctions last December for delivery of capacity in 2021, 2022 and 2023, which I've shown the results of on the right there. Poland sees modernisation of its ageing coal fleet as the most viable approach for meeting EU regulations around SOx and NOx emissions and CO2 targets, while avoiding reliance on imported gas. To encourage investment in cleaner, more efficient plant, the market awards longer contracts for upgraded plant or entirely new developments, meaning new plant. The capacity market is seen as vital for driving the coal fleet upgrade, and has awarded 15-year contracts to 5 new ultra supercritical plants, which are represented by the dark band at the bottom of the plots. A considerable amount of upgraded capacity was also awarded 5-year contracts in the first auction. That's the slightly darker, slightly paler grey in 2021. This was mainly aimed at efficiency upgrades and pollutant controls to meet EU standards. The clearing price in Poland is relatively high, and it's much higher than the similar market, than those achieved by the similar market, which was launched in the UK in 2014. That's due to generally less competition on the market. So again, Germany represents a contrasting approach in the EU. In 2016, there was a commitment made to an energy-only market, but it is backed up by a series of strategic reserves which are to be used in times of scarcity. There was an existing outer-market reserve known as the network reserve, which is actually aimed at dealing with inadequate transmission capacity from wind power in the north to demand centres in the south. This is something I will discuss again later. So that basically consists of thermal plants in the south, which can replace the lost wind power, which can't get down there. So added to this recently are the capacity reserve, which is contracting around 2 gigawatts of plant. I think a competitive tender is running at the moment. And there's also something called the security standby, which has been created for basically as a use for the aging inefficient lignite units, which Germany would like to close down to help meet its CO2 targets. That's one shown on the right. There is currently a surplus of capacity in Germany and flatlining demand, so price spikes are relatively infrequent. We don't really see the same situation as we saw in ERCOT. European Union policy looms large for electricity market issues in member states. There's a general preference for encouraging free market competition and a level playing field between the individual markets. In general, the EU is not a fan of capacity markets, but it did allow the creation of the markets in the UK, Poland and Italy in recognition of a genuine adequacy need. However, a major restriction emerged in the 2017 Winter Package Collection of Energy Directives, which sought to prevent capacity contracts to plants producing more than 550 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, in other words, coal plants. This led to some protests from member states, particularly concerning the fact that strategic reserves like the one in Germany were exempt from the restriction. However, wrangling over the exact implementation of the rule led to an acceptable outcome for Poland, in which all planned coal plants could scrape through before a deadline at the end of 2019. However, existing coal plants in Poland will stop receiving payments from 2026. The new plants will continue getting their 15-year contract, which I guess goes to around 2035. So to summarise that resource adequacy section, the growth in variable renewables has made it fundamentally more challenging to assess future resource adequacy, as well as stifling investment in thermal plants in some regions. Capacity auctions are politically popular, but can be costly for consumers and are very sensitive to parameters. They do not always achieve the desired result. There is a tendency for existing plant or low capital capacity to be favoured over new efficient plant unless other factors are in play. On the other hand, the energy-only approach requires sailing close to the wind with potentially unpopular scarcity events and high electricity prices. There is no question that coal plant benefits much more from capacity markets, but its role is increasingly being squeezed in Europe by the CO2 regulation and in the US by low gas prices. So now let's turn to the other half of this webinar, in which I'm going to talk about grid services, also known as ancillary services. This term is not that well defined, but it broadly describes actions taken by the system operator between the closure of the wholesale market and physical delivery of electricity. as well as other services procured to ensure grid reliability. As mentioned earlier, the main operations are to do with precisely balancing supply and demand in real time to maintain grid frequency and balancing reactive power throughout the grid to control grid voltage. System operators may also need to instruct plants to turn down or up to work around transmission constraints, and some plants throughout the grid need to be capable of starting up without external power supply in the event of a blackout. This is known as black start. Generators are compensated for these services through markets, tenders, or bilateral negotiation, depending on the level of competition available. So ancillary services present a relatively small proportion of the total energy costs in all grids. As wind and solar plant have not conventionally been able to provide most of these grid balancing functions, there's been some expectation that the value of ancillary services may increase. However, as we will see, this has not always proved true. Let's take a closer look at grid balancing and frequency control, which relates to changes in active power output or demand. This is usually categorized according to response speed. Primary control is a very rapid response occurring at the plant level. It's provided automatically by the steam governors of thermal plant. Secondary control within a few minutes, also known as frequency regulation in the US, is often controlled by automatic signals from a system operator. Tertiary control refers to a slower response as operating or even non-operational units ramp up to maintain a longer lasting power output and take over from primary and secondary control. Usually the system operator procures reserves of plant which can be guaranteed to offer these services throughout the day, although some level of primary control is often a mandatory requirement. Another related characteristic is synchronous inertia, or the rotational mass in turbines which synchronize to the grid frequency. This acts to slow the rate of frequency change and gives grid balancing actions more time to take effect. As this is only provided by synchronous generators like coal, CCGT and nuclear plants, grid inertia has declined in many regions, particularly smaller grids with high penetration of renewables. Inertia has conventionally been taken for granted and not compensated as an ancillary service. However, some grids are beginning to take mitigating measures against declining inertia. This could include ensuring sufficient thermal plant remains online through other ancillary service products, deploying synchronous condensers, which are like free spinning turbines, not in a power plant, using synthetic inertia, which is kind of an electronic control which mimics the effect of inertia, procuring faster frequency response products. This is often provided by batteries. Or I think in the case of Ireland in particular, they've actually introduced a new service product for synchronous inertia. This table was made by PJM and it sums up what I've been saying regarding the ability of various plants to provide some of these services. As you can see, coal plant is very good at providing most ancillary services, although it's limited by a short minimum runtime and relatively slow startup. Solar and wind plant are capable of performing some grid balancing actions, particularly turning down to provide secondary or tertiary control, but have normally been exempt from grid requirements for primary control or reactive power. However, in recent years, there's a drive to require renewable energy to engage more in these services, with the US regulator now requiring all plants to provide both primary control and reactive power through addition of appropriate power electronics. This slide shows the breakdown of what types of plant provided frequency control service in Germany in 2017. Hydropower, which has rapid response capability, features heavily. Hard coal and lignite plants together are used mainly for tertiary control, but also make up a significant proportion of the non-hydro component of primary and secondary control. This looks more in more depth at the situation in Germany. This plot shows how the cost of various grid services has changed over a 5-year period in which renewable generation has nearly doubled. Remarkably, the cost of secondary and tertiary control has actually plummeted in this period. This has been attributed to improvements in market design, such as procurement closer to real time, as well as greater competition from providers within Germany and from neighbouring countries. On the other hand, grid costs have come to be dominated by actions related to transmission constraints, both in compensation to renewable plant to be curtailed, this is shown as feed-in compensation, and paying other plants to ramp up to replace the lost power, which is known as redispatching. This plot shows similar information, but highlights that the increase in redispatch and curtailment costs, as well as procurement of the network reserve, which I mentioned earlier, has tended to outweigh the saving from declining frequency control costs. And on the right is a depiction of the transmission problem in Germany, where wind plants are located mainly in the north of the country, but there's insufficient transmission capacity to take the power to the large demand centres in the south. Expansion of the network infrastructure in Germany has run into some problems with local opposition to power lines. In Great Britain, there is a very similar story taking place, with grid balancing costs dominated by transmission constraint management costs in recent years. As in Germany, a lot of wind power is located in the north, such as in Scotland, and there is limited transmission capacity to demand centres in the south. In the plot on the right, the orange transmission constraint line and the black reactive power line are just two components of the total cost shown in blue. The remainder is made up by an unusually wide array of ancillary services, which is used by the national grid system operator. The total cost has followed a gradually increasing trend, and there is also much greater volatility in cost throughout the year. Coal is used to some extent for redispatch actions in Britain, but often this involves plants paying the grid to turn down rather than the other way around. Coal plant retirements have taken place in an extraordinary pace in the UK since 2013, meaning that some of the remaining plants have temporarily secured lucrative contracts to continue providing services such as black start capability. However, looking at the income of a typical coal plant in the country, it can be seen that ancillary services represent less than 2% of wholesale energy income. What's more, participation in most ancillary service markets requires that the plant is already running in the energy market. And this is increasingly rare for coal plant in the UK, where a relatively high CO2 price has pushed them behind gas plant in the dispatch order. National Grid is currently undertaking a full review of ancillary service products and procurement to adapt to changing grid composition. Returning now to the US, the plot on the left shows how ancillary services in purple, they're shown in purple here, are the very small component of the all-in electricity price in ERCOT, Texas. Here we can also see the effect of the price adders I mentioned before. On the right, we can more clearly see the general trend in ancillary service costs. This has been on a declining trend from 2014 to 2017, but it leapt up again in 2018. This is apparently related to increased procurement of something called responsive reserves, which are used by ERCOT to ensure adequate levels of primary control and grid inertia from plant running on the grid. So here are broken down those responsive reserves by fuel type, showing that CCGT provides the bulk of the provision in ERCOT, but the coal contribution has actually been growing in recent years. Some have noted that a decline in reserve size in ERCOT between 2014 and 2017 took place during a period of significant expansion in wind generation, although this trend has been bucked with the increase in 2018. As for Germany, factors affecting the size of frequency control reserves are complex and can be more influenced by market design, federal regulations, and changes in calculation methods. In ERCOT, the previous reduction seems to have been brought about largely by increased time resolution in the wholesale market and better incorporation of wind forecast data. Nevertheless, ERCOT is a large but relatively constrained grid with limited connection to neighbouring grids, so declining levels of inertia are of some concern and subject to ongoing work. Australia represents another interesting case study, and the last one I'll talk about. The eastern part of the country is covered by a single grid known as the National Electricity Market, which is around 5,000 kilometres long, but includes less than 50 gigawatts of generating capacity. This makes it particularly vulnerable to the effects of changes in grid composition. The state of South Australia has become a banner bearer for renewable energy, reaching over 50% of wind and solar power. At the same time, that's mainly wind. At the same time, around 4.6 gigawatt of coal was closed in the NEM between 2012 and 2017, which includes a 520 megawatt unit in South Australia. In 2014, South Australia experienced a full-scale blackout following a sequence of events triggered by storm damage to power lines, but ultimately was down to the inability of the state to rapidly form a stable, isolated grid when it was cut off from neighbouring states. The blackout helped trigger some far-reaching analysis of ancillary services and grid reliability issues for the whole of the NEM. As thermal plant has been retired, the cost of frequency control services in the NEM has soared from 2014, going from a minor component of total ancillary service costs to the dominant factor, as seen on the plot on the left. In 2015 and 2016, a lot of this cost increase appears to be related to large price spikes taking place in South Australia in periods when the state has again become isolated and there's insufficient local provision. However, commissioning of Tesla's famous Hornsdale Power Reserve battery in December 2017 seems to have dealt with frequency control issues in South Australia. Nevertheless, high costs have continued in 2018 and for the first 3 quarters of 2019, as other parts of the country seem to be also susceptible to price spikes. There has been a review of the frequency control framework in the NEM, and a minimum inertia requirement was imposed on network operators in 2017. In response, South Australia is commissioning a series of synchronous condensers from next year. The plot on the right shows the breakdown of one frequency control service by fuel type, showing the growing role of batteries and a declining but still significant role for coal. So we're nearly finished, but I'd also like to cover a bit of a seasonal issue which has emerged in the US in the last few years, which is that of grid resilience to unusual weather events such as the severe cold snaps experienced in the winters of 2014 and 2017. These became famous worldwide thanks mainly to their exciting names, the polar vortex and the bomb cyclone. During these periods, grids in the northeast of the country particularly suffered severe gas shortages for power generation as gas prices soared or were prioritised for residential heating, and some plants and pipelines experienced cold-related technical issues. Although the grids were ultimately resilient to the events, a study by the NETL in 2018 showed that the bulk of additional generation was provided by coal plants, and they noted that many of these plants were scheduled for retirement. Increasing the gas capability in many parts of the northeast US is limited by insufficient growth in pipeline capacity. Some northeastern grids have responded to the situation by introducing enhanced capacity market products, which require generators to ensure they have long-term gas supply contracts or the ability to switch to oil. Lastly, the report does not only cover liberalised energy markets, but also looks at some Asian countries which are currently developing less regulated markets and are beginning to deal with some of the same issues around balancing markets which I've covered today. An example I've highlighted here is a situation in northeastern China where there is a lot of wind capacity, but there has been unnecessarily high curtailment of wind due to insufficient incentives for coal plant to turn down to allow it onto the grid. A pilot system has been introduced in these provinces in which plants bid their price and their capability for turning downwards in a daily auction. This has led to a significant reduction in wind curtailment. It should be noted, however, that in a liberalised market, this kind of action would be the role of the wholesale market rather than the grid service. Markets for true frequency control services are being trialled in other provinces. The report also looks at emerging issues in India, where there's a drive to increase cross-state procurement of balancing power, which could deal with solar curtailment, and Japan, which is developing ancillary service markets and may also be introducing a capacity market. So to summarise that section, the value in ancillary service markets remains limited despite the growth in renewable energy in many parts of the world. For larger grids, more efficient markets and greater competition, such as from batteries or demand response, has often countered any potential increase in value. In some smaller grids, however, there are genuine reliability issues arising with high renewables penetration, and markets are being redesigned to reflect the level of performance required from generators and other service providers. In the GB grid and Germany, we've seen that transmission constraints are the main cost arising from renewables, and network upgrade projects are ongoing there. In general, there is inherent uncertainty in the ancillary service market, as it will always represent a trade-off between what system operators are prepared to internalise as network costs, perhaps through deployment of batteries, power electronics, or network improvements, and what they will procure from generators. At the same time, the value provided by a given plant is strongly linked to changes in the network around it. Here I will try to bring together, just to close, try to bring together the themes covered in this report from both sections. What I've observed is that new markets are being developed to deal with the transition taking place in this sector, but often the pace of change has been difficult to cope with, particularly with respect to very rapid retirement of coal plants currently providing essential services. There is undoubtedly still a vital role for thermal plants in our power grids, but in most of the liberalised markets I've looked at, this role will increasingly be taken by gas plants. However, in the deregulated markets emerging in Asia, where gas power remains limited, coal will retain a role for firm capacity and for grid balancing as renewable capacity grows. Here, lessons can certainly be learnt from the experiences of the more established markets. So that brings the webinar to an end, and I'll just see if we have any questions, give everyone a bit of time. Probably everyone fell asleep somewhere halfway through the webinar. Have we got any questions? I don't think we have any questions yet, so we can sit around. Enjoying some dead air. So what's the next webinar? We got important announcements to make. So the next webinar from the Clean Coal Centre will be on Wednesday, the 22nd of January. Got a bit of a wait, and that will be on the energy trilemma from Dr. Leslie Sloss. And while I've been stalling, I can see we've got a couple of questions coming in. They're pouring in. So someone asking for the slides. Yeah, the slides will be downloadable from the website very shortly, and I think you can enjoy the actual presentation on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. Should we be moving away from coal in any case? We've got some very sort of high-level questions here. Should we be moving away from coal in any case? I guess that's not really subject to this talk or something we tend to comment on. I mean, I think there's a general trend to move away from coal in many parts of the world, but coal still represents a strikingly large proportion of the power mix worldwide. So the transition is maybe slower than is perceived, often perceived here in the West, and we'll need to continue looking at how those coal plants can help operate within a cleaner grid. And as we've seen, they can also actually help increase the efficiency of or increase the usage of renewable energy in some parts of the world. What's the minimum coal use in the US in gigawatts? Someone asked, what will the minimum coal use be in the US with another 50 scheduled to close? Yeah, I mean, the decline in coal in some parts of the US is quite notable. There's obviously coming under high pressure from gas, but there's really quite a significant installed capacity in the US. So I don't think anyone's expecting the proportion of coal to I think a general outlook is that it will remain fairly significant. It will remain a significant part of the energy mix for another decade or two, particularly in regions such as PJM, which are quite reliant on coal. Maybe less so in other parts of the country where there's more rapid growth in renewables. So someone's asked, does this not serve to highlight through the examples you have given that coal and gas are still a long way from being usurped by renewable energy? Yeah, I think there's a clear role, as I said at the end, there's a clear role for a thermal plant. I think maybe that point has been clouded somewhat by the fact that the growth in the value of ancillary services is not dramatically changed. I think that maybe hides the fact that thermal plant is still doing an awful lot on these grids. It's providing the bulk of generation, and it's ramping up in the wholesale market. You know, a lot of this is really it comes under the wholesale market, which is natural, which is day-to-day ramping up in response to variable output from renewable plant. So yeah, but I mean, there's definitely a role for a continuing role for gas plants in these liberalised markets. We just see that it's increasingly taking the place of the coal plant that's retiring, because in most regions, although we do see new coal in Poland, we see a shortage, or really an absence of new coal investment, and these capacity markets are really trying to drive new gas. So we're kind of running out of time here, but the another question is, are electricity market designs applicable in economies where monopoly exists, where there is a single grid and owned by a state? Yeah, I mean, I guess I tried to highlight that at the beginning of the presentation. This is much less of an issue in highly regulated state-owned markets, where the system operator essentially has the ability to, or the utility has the power to invest in capacity as it sees fit, and not often subject to regulation, but well, always subject to regulation, but it can invest in capacity as it sees fit and pass that on through the regulated tariff. When it comes to how those markets operate ancillary services, that's a bit more complicated. They're normally also a sort of component of the tariff, often operated quite inefficiently, as we saw in the example in China, and that's really something which is changing in many markets, and that's touched on more in the report. But yeah, most of those regions are kind of undergoing liberalization. Certainly in Japan and India, we see much more liberalized markets now, or an ongoing process of liberalization. And even in China, there's a move towards more market trading of electricity. So I think that's all the questions. I hope they were more or less clear examples. If you want more detail, then please feel free to email me on the email showing at the bottom of the screen. Just got another question come in, which I've probably got time to answer. This pertains to the issue where Scotland is paying wind operators, I guess that's National Grid really, but there's a lot of payments to wind operators in Scotland in particular, as I highlighted, to stop generating. What are my thoughts on cost of grid balancing in this respect? Well, I mean, it was shown in the plot earlier. These costs are significant in Great Britain, and it's really something that needs to be countered through investment in the network. There has been recently installation of a new, I guess, DC transmission line from Scotland to northwest England, called the Western Interconnect or something, I think, which is, I suppose, aimed at alleviating that situation. I'm sure we'll continue to see developments like that. But yeah, these are big projects which require a lot of capital. And at the moment we have a slightly absurd situation. So there is a cost to renewable deployment, which relates to its the need to locate it close to resources rather than close to demand. So it's a kind of a fundamental attribute, but it's not something which really represents value for a coal plant. So yeah, I think that's it. Let's wrap this up. Got anything more to say? Thank you all for joining us, and goodbye.